Hi, my name is Dr. Corliss Thompson, and I am a faculty member at Northeastern University. I've been here for 3 years. I got my PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I studied educational research, more specifically qualitative research, program evaluation, teacher education, and critical multicultural education. I got the job or the position at Northeastern right after I finished graduate school, a couple months after I finished. And at the time, I thought I was going to be moving to Boston when I found out that I had gotten the position at Northeastern. But I learned that they were expanding their global outreach, and that they had a campus here in Charlotte, and that a lot of the faculty actually are located in multiple places, around the United States, as well as, around the world. So I was really excited to learn that I didn't actually have to move to Boston and endure the cold. But anyway, I'm located in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm from Charlotte. That's where I grew up. That's where I first started teaching elementary school many years ago. North Carolina is home for me. So the question about, teaching presence, I use teaching presence in my class. Well, before I can really think about teaching presence in a class, I think it's first important for me as an instructor to think about, what is my teaching philosophy? Because, whether I'm in person or whether I'm online, there's certain principles that guide my teaching. And so for me personally, there's a couple different ideas that I'll just share briefly that really guide how I teach. One of the ideas is from Vygotsky, this idea of the more knowledgeable other. And I feel like as an instructor, I have knowledge, experience, skills that my students may not have developed the way that they want to develop them, or there's something that they learn that I know that I want to help them with. So there's this idea that I, as a faculty member, am helping, develop my students. I'm more knowledgeable in a certain area, not to say in all areas, but in a certain area, and I'm giving that information to them. So the more knowledgeable other. Another piece is related to experience. And so I draw a lot on John Dewey for that, but this idea that people learn through their own experiences. They learn from their previous experiences, and if learning is truly educative, it's going to help them have additional experiences, additional things that they're able to learn and grow from. Another one of my big theorists in terms of my teaching philosophy is Bell Hooks, and this idea that theory has to be connected to practice in order for it to be meaningful. So really this integration of theory and practice. And then the final piece of my teaching philosophy really relates to being culturally relevant and understanding that culture is a big part of who we are, and we bring that into the classroom with us. And Ladson Billings talks about this ethic of care and how important it is to have this caring relationship with your students. So given all of that, I try to bring experience, being the more knowledgeable other, caring, and this connection between theory and practice into my classroom, and that informs my teaching. So then the question about, well, how do I bring my presence into an online classroom? My goal is to bring all of those pieces with me into the classroom as I'm teaching. And so related to, some practical examples that I actually use in my classroom, one of the first things that I try to do in my classrooms relates to introductions. And that happens at the beginning of the term. So at the beginning of the term, most courses, have in Blackboard, discussion board, an opportunity to introduce yourself. And so I think it's important for me as an instructor to introduce myself to my students, but it's also important for my students to introduce themselves to each other and also to me. And so when I give out those first instructions about introducing yourself, I try to be very strategic in what I ask students to put in those introductions. I may ask for students to talk about their research interests, or I may ask them about, what is their concentration. And I use that information in their introductions to really find out, okay, who is this person, important experiences that they have that are related to the course. That way I can think about how to incorporate that into the course. So really finding out who they are so I can build on that and kind of have that information in my mind just going into the quarter as I plan for different activities and different group assignments, and just my approach to students. The other important piece of that introduction is that I actually respond back to the introduction. So Students will say something about themselves, they'll tell me who they are, but I always respond back either with a question or a comment, or sometimes I'll look for commonalities with students. If I see anything that, that resonates with me, I'll mention that. Or if there's something that I was looking for them to talk about that they didn't mention, I'll definitely ask them a follow-up question related to, who they are and what they're bringing to the course with them. So definitely introductions are a big piece of that. Another piece of how I incorporate teaching presence into my classroom really relates to weekly communication. So every week I'll send my students an email. Usually it's on Friday, or sometimes it's on Monday, but it's the email that wraps up the previous week or the current week and pushes us forward into that following or to the coming week. So I'll send out an email, and in that email it's kind of like I'll try to capture the important things from class in the previous week. So I'll make sure that I've read the discussion board and I've interacted with the discussion board, depending on kind of what my discussion board role and policy is for the course. But I'll take those ideas that students are talking about and I'll connect them to the readings, or I'll connect it to an idea that's a current event, or if there's something that students all struggled with or several students struggled with that I want to try to clear up, I'll use that email as a way to kind of draw their attention to something. Discussion on the discussion board, and there's a need for additional resources or additional readings or additional points. I'll use that email kind of as a teaching mechanism to kind of tie all that together. The students are really putting their voices out there on the discussion board, sharing their thoughts about the readings, but I feel like it's my role as an instructor to kind of pull that together. Some people do that on the discussion board itself, and then and I do some of that as well, but I also try to make sure that there's kind of a final synthesis of whatever the topic or the objectives were for that week, and I use the email for that. I also use the email to really set up what we're going to do in the next week or in the coming week. So it's where I can connect the weeks together and say, okay, this is where we are right now. This is where we're headed for next week. Here are the important things that I want you to think about. Here are the important things that I want you to consider as you read. Maybe there's an order to the readings that I would like to recommend, or maybe there's key points from the readings that I want to make sure that they remember or they think about. Maybe there's an assignment coming up or a couple of tidbits, helpful hints for an upcoming assignment. I'll put all of that in the email. And then also in the email, I try to be very careful about using subheadings, maybe even bullets, just so that it's not one big long chunk of text that's hard to read through, but that students can really pinpoint the key ideas that I want to make sure that they get. And for me, it's not just about inserting my presence for them, but it's also for me to just kind of have a sense of, okay, here's where things are at in the course. These are the things that I need to make sure that I'm looking for in this upcoming week. So it's kind of a check-in for me and for my students to kind of just make sure we're all on the same page. And then I also would say that it's also a planning tool for me in terms of preparing for that next week. So I can use that email as kind of a checkpoint to say, okay, I'm prepared for this next week. I'm ready to go into the next week of instruction. So email is definitely another way. Just while I'm on the topic of email, I think it's not just about, sending out these long formal emails weekly, but for me, it's about responding to student emails. That's another way I insert my presence. I always, at the end of emails, I always say, if you have any other questions, feel free to follow up with me, or, let me know if this makes sense. But because I'm not there in person with my students, email communication becomes really important. Everybody has their different take on that, how they communicate with students, but I just think it's important online to be communicative. And in some ways, I have to be overly communicative online because I'm not there in person with you. I can't just assume that in the hallway as I pass by you, or that, we'll have a conversation about this after class. So email is definitely important. The formal emails, the short, just back and forth emails to answer a question for students. Another way that I insert instructor presence is through video conferencing or video lectures. So this wouldn't be necessarily a back and forth, but it might be. Sometimes I'll have like a GoToMeeting session or a Google Hangout session for my students, where they're actually there in person with me live. If I do that, I'll make sure I record it so that students who aren't there can go back and watch the recording later. But in terms of those video sessions, I will have an explicit purpose for the session. I usually don't have them just to have them. Online, it's hard to hang out unless there's or I found personally, it's hard to just kind of be online, just be online. Usually there has to be some kind of plan or purpose or some kind of intention. So I'll have these Google Hangouts with my students where I will either discuss something that's important that's coming up. I teach research design. Sometimes there's specific content pieces that are hard to get from just reading. And sometimes hearing about it or being able to ask somebody a question about a particular piece of content or a skill makes the learning process just that much easier, and it speeds up the process. Another way I use the video Hangouts are sometimes for support with readings and different theoretical concepts. So sometimes all the time I'll send out an article, but sometimes I know based on my own experience in reading it, maybe from my own graduate school experience, knowing that some of the texts are just difficult to get through, but at the same time, knowing that some of these texts have key points that if you don't get the key point from this text, you'll miss part of the entire focus of the class. So I'll have my students, I'll prepare a short PowerPoint. My PowerPoints usually are never fancy, just kind of a discussion guide really about some of those key ideas. One of those, I guess, topics that I prepared a video for my students was related to the topic of ideology. Ideology, the theories can get really thick, especially if you're not used to that type of language, the type of examples that are used in the text. So what I'll do is I'll talk through my students, similar how I'm talking to you, is I'll just prepare some key points. I'll pull out some key quotes that they want to make sure that they're dissecting as they read, and I'll just give them a little guidance as they go through it. I don't do that for everything, but just sometimes I feel like students need the extra support, especially depending on the topic. And I think as instructors, we know the areas that, students typically, that are kind of maybe pitfalls for students or things that we want to make sure that they get. And again, for me, it goes back to course objectives. There are certain objectives that my students get. And as an instructor, I kind of think strategically throughout the course to see, okay, where are the self so that my students can hear from me and get some guidance related to the ideas that I want them to be thinking about. And I want to reiterate that it's just guidance, right? So part of my teaching philosophy relates to theory, practice, experience. So it's not about me driving my ideas into the students, but it's about me as more knowledgeable other than the guidance and support, and the video conferencing is a way. For that, I've used, Kaltura. It used to be called Camtasia. I've used that. I also use Google Hangouts because it's easy to just kind of create a YouTube link from a Google Hangout. And that allows for the students to kind of join you if they'd like to, whereas Kaltura, at least the version that I've used, is kind of a more, it's not as interactive. It doesn't allow for the interaction. I've also used VoiceThread. VoiceThread is another way that you can allow for student input. I like VoiceThread a lot because it will allow you to kind of say what you would like to say, but then it will also allow your students to ask a question, to respond back. Sometimes VoiceThread is really helpful for, that's another way I use video conferencing to explain the assignments. That way I just make sure that everybody has, what I'm thinking about it, and that way my thoughts are clear. But if there are questions about the assignment, the students can post their questions there. That way they're not having to, that way they're not having to, or I'm not having to repeat myself. The questions are already there on VoiceThread. Everybody can see it, and if students ask me a question, that's where I'll point them. That way I'm not having to redo everything. So video conferencing is a great tool because once you explain it one time, it's out there for everyone, and you can refer people back to that. And it's not like I'm having to re-answer the same questions that I had already anticipated that I was going to answer. And that always also, I think, reduces the amount of time I'm having to spend answering questions after the fact because I've already explained it up front. And so for me, because I can't be there with you in person, I have to have some way of giving you that kind of information, and having those interactive spaces definitely help. Because it's an asynchronous program, I can't require my students to all be at the same time, at the same place, not for all the courses anyway. And so having that live session as an option is great for a lot of students. That way they get that interaction, but then recording it also allows it and makes it accessible for everyone. It's another great feature. So definitely the emails, definitely the video conferencing, the video chatting, and just being communicative with students. I think also just setting that invitation, saying, you know, I'm available for a conversation. I don't have office hours, but I always let my students know that I'm available for a conversation. A lot of times students that take me up on the offer will just be a quick phone call. Sometimes I think the phone call is shorter than students maybe anticipate that it will be. Usually they're always driving the conversation, coming to me with what it is that they need to talk about. But sometimes that immediate conversation so much more quickly, a lot of issues can definitely be resolved just in a quick phone call. I think that's probably about it for tools that I use for instructor presence. Oh no, one more thing. So feedback. Feedback to me is another way of giving the instructor presence. So because my students aren't there with me, I have to build in ways where I can give them feedback on their assignments in a formative way, also in a summative way. And I think this feeds into one of your other questions. But this idea that students need to know how they perform on something, and me as a more knowledgeable other can give them that feedback to help guide them towards meeting those course objectives. So in my mind, I'll use my rubrics for assignments, and based on the rubric, I'll say, okay, this is right. I need more here. I need you to add more there. I use track changes. That way I can kind of be really hands-on with, you know, this is something that you can fix. Or also the neat thing about track change, a model for students what needs to be fixed. Now I won't go through and track changes the entire paper, but I can do track changes in a few spots that will point out to students kind of where they need to fix something, how they need to fix it. And sometimes for a lot of students, just being able to see the example, being able to see it highlighted will really help them kind of know exactly what they need to do to make changes. Sometimes for students, especially the students that, you know, maybe in terms of assessment, they've done everything or close to everything that I've asked them to do, I'll add comments. So I'll use Word feature of just adding comments. Blackboard, I also has a feature of adding comments. And so if I don't download it into Word, then I'll just do it in Blackboard and I'll just put these comments. And sometimes my comments will just kind of be my stream of consciousness, my thoughts as I'm reading the paper. Maybe it's that, you know, this makes me think of another author, or this makes me think of another example, or this makes me think of something somebody said on the discussion board. Basically just trying to mimic that idea of having a conversation, having a back and forth becomes really important. And I should have also mentioned that I teach doctoral students mostly, as well as master's students. So I think for graduate students especially, it's not about, you know, this is right and this is wrong. It's about helping them further their ideas and modeling this idea that a scholarship can really broaden our ideas and really help us think in different ways. So it's really about kind of adding in the scholarship, adding in questions, asking them questions to further their thinking about a particular idea. But definitely feedback is a helpful way for me to insert myself. That way students kind of know what's in my head, what I'm thinking about their work. And then also about feedback, it's important to really give the feedback in a timely way. I know timely looks different for different programs and different people, but what I find is that if I can give students feedback on an assignment before the next assignment is due, they can actually use that feedback to improve the next assignment. And so usually that's my goal. Give the students feedback in time so that they can make the changes to their next assignment, so that it informs their next assignment. That way the feedback also becomes a teaching tool. And so I think that, I know just from hearing from my students, they've found that the feedback to be really helpful. In terms of formative and summative assessment strategies, I definitely for formative assessment, I use discussion board a lot. I think the key for assessment is really knowing what it is that you want to assess and then thinking about how you can integrate that into your class. So for graduate students, assessment really is about, it's assessing kind of their thought process and their ideas. So discussion boards can be assessed, you know, but it's really about what is it on the discussion board that I'm looking for you to be able to know or be able to do. So on the discussion board, am I looking for you to be able to connect your personal experiences back to particular theories? I can look to see if you do quickly look at a discussion board to see, are you just talking about your own experiences, or are you really digging into the text? Are you pulling quotes? Are you explaining those quotations and connecting that back to your ideas? Or did you just kind of throw in a citation, but really you're talking mostly about your ideas? Looking for that on the discussion board in a formative way is a really helpful tool for building students' capacity to do the work on the final summative assessments. So I try to model, as I'm looking at the discussion board and giving you know, comments or feedback, how students can improve their writing, improve their ideas, or whatever it is that I'm looking for in a way on the discussion board, so that when they do turn in their assignment that I'm going to grade, they'll be more ready to, I guess, perform on that assessment in a way that really demonstrates not only their capacity, but my ability as an instructor to really help them get to the level that they need to be at. Another helpful thing for me is if I can think of discussion board as a tool for, if I can think about discussion board as a tool for formative assessment, it helps me learn how to engage on the discussion board better. Sometimes discussion boards can be challenging, I think, in an online setting. I mean, and I think it's challenging because it's kind of like, okay, so what do I want to talk, how do I respond to these students on the discussion board? What do I do? What do I want to talk about? If I know going into a discussion board, you know, here are the 5 key skills that I want to look for in my students this week. As I'm reading it, I can be thinking, okay, well, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, and I can pick one of those things to kind of comment on to help support their thinking in an area. So discussion board, definitely formative assessment, but it has to be done, it has to be planned in advance to really have your discussion board align with the course objectives for that particular week, and then as an instructor know how I'm going to interact on discussion board in that particular week. What is my role? And that also helps me, I think, speed up my process of giving feedback, because I know I'm not commenting on everything. You know, I'm looking at the discussion board for a very particular purpose, and that's what I'm going to comment on. I also use discussion board not necessarily just for having discussions, or maybe it's having discussions, but sometimes I'll have my students post drafts of an upcoming assignment that I'm going to grade for the course. For some of the research courses, we'll have students post their research questions or a draft of their problem statement. And again, I can assess that on the discussion board, and I can say, okay, well, what about this? Or did you think about this? Did you consider this? Or this doesn't make sense to me. What did you mean here? Asking them those kind of questions to help them get closer to the place where they're ready to be summatively assessed. The other cool thing about, I think, discussion board and formative assessment is this idea that not only am I formatively assessing, but I can get the students to help formatively assess each other. So, you know, giving students, okay, you know, the particular feedback of, I want you to assess, you know, I want you to look for this, or I want you to respond to at least 2 people, and here's what I want you to focus on. And helping them think about how to give each other feedback also is helpful. But again, all of this is guided through my presence as an instructor and me giving instructions for students as to how I want them to give each other feedback, and as well as how I give them feedback. In terms of summative assessment for graduate students, again, it's usually not, well, depending on the course, it's not a right, this is wrong, but it's really me assessing their thought process and how they're putting ideas together. Maybe I'm assessing their writing, their scholarly writing, the content of their writing. With research design, it might be assessing, the clarity. Are they able to articulate their rationale for their research and support it with other research? And so for summative assessments, it could be a paper, it could be a presentation, but I think the key is having kind of the big assessment, but having kind of the smaller objectives underneath and being clear about what those objectives are. I'm assessing you on the style of your writing. I'm assessing you on your APA format. I'm assessing you on your ability to connect theory to your own experiences. I'm assessing you on your ability to cite relevant literature. So really being clear, I think, at the outset as an instructor about the purposes of your assignments and how those assignments really map backwards to your course objectives. And then, of course, that ties back into this idea of instructor presence in the first place, and really thinking about how can I insert myself in the course in a way that's going to help students meet the objectives, and then assessing them, how do I know that they were actually able to meet those particular objectives? So how do I create a community of practice or a community of learners in my online courses? For me, it's about thinking back to, introducing students at the very beginning, having them introduce themselves to each other, really thinking about, what are the things that I want students to talk about in their introductions? What are the key ideas that other students would find of interest just in their journey as graduate students or doctoral students? And then, what would be important to them in terms of thinking about this course? A lot of times I'll have students introduce kind of their focus for the course. So if you tell me that you're focusing on charter schools, then there may be somebody else in the course that also wants to focus on charter schools. And by saying those things that you want them to make sure that they address in the introduction, it can help them start to think about other people that they would want to connect with. It also helps me as the instructor think about, okay, who am I going to put in this particular group? Who am I going to put in this particular group? Who am I going to put in this particular group? And I think the groups become important, whether we're talking about group for a course assignment or whether we're talking about a group for discussion board. That's another way people build community in the course. Instead of having everybody all in the discussion board together, I'll form different groups, different pods, different segments, whatever you want to call them, but basically small groups of people having the discussions together. It helps students get to know each other a little bit more and also have more familiarity with different people's ideas. The way I form the groups depends on the course. Sometimes I'll form the groups by profession. So I'll have a group of my higher ed folks, I'll have a group of people that are working in corporate settings, and I'll have a work of people that are working in maybe K through 12 schools. It just depends on the makeup of the course. For a different course, again, it could be topical. So if everybody's interested, this particular term in examining race, then maybe I'll have kind of a group that's interested in race, and I'll have a group that's interested in examining social class, or I'll have a group that's interested in examining teachers. So I think that, again, that goes back to just knowing who your students are, knowing what experiences are important to them, so that you can begin to form meaningful groups. I'm also experimented with, just ways within the course to get folks talking together. So having folks, do an asynchronous meeting, or not asynchronous, but do a synchronous meeting together, but on their own time. They get to schedule it. And that's whether they're talking through a paper that they're working on or an idea for a particular assignment, but getting folks to actually talk to each other definitely helps build community. Also, from talking with students, I've found that they think that having a picture on their profile on Blackboard, or just sharing something that helps add kind of distinction to who you are and lets us know who you are, also helps them just remember who's who and what they do. So definitely, I think the more students are involved in discussing and sharing ideas, the more they feel that they're part of a community. But based on what I've talked with students about, is there has to be something distinct about you, something that other people, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're more special than anybody else. It's just a matter of kind of sharing who you are to the community, putting something out there. That way other people can share and participate in that community with you. But I find that students don't always do that on their own. They may need support in doing that, and that's I think another role as an instructor, for really thinking about how you can help students establish themselves online. You know, that way they can get to know other students and they can kind of build on the collegiality that's available to be had there. So if I had any suggestions for faculty that are new online instructors, you know, it's funny, I think a lot of the things that I would recommend for our students, I think are important for faculty. So this idea of having community, I definitely think it's important for you to have somebody to go to ask questions, you know, and knowing, you know, who to go to for what. But even if you just have one person that you know that doesn't mind, you know, shooting you back an email response or a text to say, okay, you need to talk to this person or talk to that person. But definitely, you know, having somebody that you can go to talk with about, or just get your questions answered. But in terms of advice for teaching online and developing a teaching presence, is just knowing that, you know, the technology is just a medium. Teaching is still driven by the instructor, and you know, depending on the type of course, depending on the program, I think the instructor's role may vary, but I think it's important for faculty to really say, this is who I am as an instructor. This is what I believe about teaching, and then look for ways to really embody that online. And I think that technology can be, I don't know, just a way that in some ways people begin to feel more distant. But I think the more that, you know, we're able to engage with each other and find ways to engage, you know, within our courses, the more teaching can feel engaged. It can feel like you're learning as an instructor, your students are learning, and that there's this this dialogical process going on. For me, it's about helping students kind of engage their own thoughts and their own ideas. And for me, as an online instructor, I think when I was new, it took me a minute to figure out, okay, how am I going to do this? You know, how am I going to convey my ideas and get their students to convey their ideas, and how can I get them talking to each other in ways that's going to further their learning? And I definitely think it can be done, but definitely having a plan, definitely planning how you're going to insert important. I think there's a lot of discussion about how to plan your course. What should Blackboard look like? You know, what about the different weeks? But I think just as important is planning out and figuring out for yourself how your instructor presence is going to fit into that Blackboard course structure. Who are you as an instructor? How are you going to fit that in? And then, you know, in terms of time management, you know, where are you going to insert those different spaces? I don't think we can do everything as online instructors, but I think we can think about, you know, what are the high impact points that I can begin to build into my teaching presence. And I think just being patient with yourself and really taking a look at student feedback, incorporating that in. Maybe every quarter you can try something a little different, build on what you've already done that works, but maybe add in a new tool or add in a new approach to instructor presence.